Hey, new prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for May 14th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So our text for today, we've got Numbers 23, then Psalm 64 and 65, Isaiah 13, and then First Peter 1, which we've been in several times in the last few weeks in sermons on Sunday. So we'll start with Isaiah 13. How about that? So this starts a section in Isaiah. So Isaiah 1 through 12 is kind of its own little section, really focusing in on Isaiah's call narrative that starts in Isaiah 6, which Isaiah, I didn't get a chance to talk about Isaiah 6, but that really does set a lot of the themes for the rest of the book of Isaiah there in his call, as it does for many of the major prophets where we do have a call narrative, such as Jeremiah 1 or Isaiah or Ezekiel 1 and 2, where we have these narratives of their call that whatever goes into their call, however God reveals himself and whatever God asks them to do kind of defines the rest of their ministry. We see that in Isaiah 6. In Isaiah 13, this starts a section in Isaiah where it's looking at oracles against the nations, oracles of judgment against the nations typically. And this first one is an oracle against Babylon. Now, of course, what's interesting is that Babylon is not the major world power at the time of Isaiah's prophecy. It's of course the Assyrians, and yet Babylon will very soon become that ascendant world power in just a few decades after Isaiah dies. Now, a couple of things that this shows me. One thing, it shows God's concern for not just Israel, not just his people, but his concern for justice and righteousness in the world as a whole. This verse 11, it says, "I will punish the world for its evil." Right? God is one who is a worldwide God. He's not just a God for the Israelites. The other thing that this shows me is a major theme that we'll see throughout many of the rest of the prophets, and we've talked about this theme a little bit already, but it's the theme of the day of the Lord. Verse 6, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near." Now, when we think of the day of the Lord, we typically think of that one eschatological day, right, where God will come and judge the world, and he will Jesus will come again, right, the second coming. Uh, that's definitely the day of the Lord, but the prophets also speak of days of the Lord, right? And the day of the Lord is basically when God inserts himself into space and time history to affect his plans and purposes providentially. So, for instance, one of those days of the Lord would happen for Babylon when the Medes are used. The Medes are just another. It's kind of referring to the Persians in that area of modern day Iran. They would be the ones, the Persians would be the ones who come in and take over the Babylonian Empire in 539 BC. And basically what Isaiah is saying here is when that happens, this is for God's plans and purposes. God will be doing it this is not just going to be these nations operating on their own. God is using them for his purposes. And ultimately that purpose would be, as we've talked about with in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and at the end of the book of Chronicles, that purpose was, of course, for God to bring his people back to the promised land. So God is working. He's working in his people, yes, but he's also working in the nations. And so it's a helpful text in seeing that global perspective on things in the Old Testament. That brings us to, we'll go over to Psalm 64 and 65. So we have two types of Psalms here. We have another Psalm of Lament in in Psalm 64, verse 1, "Hear my voice, O God, hear my in my complaint, preserve my life from the dread of my enemy." So here again, individualized, personalized lamentation before God. It always strikes me that just the boldness of some of these laments, the admonition of God, the plea to God to hear, is not just a plea of desperation; it's a plea of confidence, isn't it? That there's only one reason to ask God to hear, and that is that you think he will, right? And that we have a God that is near and that hears. And then Psalm 65 is a psalm of thanksgiving. And it's a psalm that ultimately expresses the inner desires of this psalmist to thank God for what he has done. It's also a psalm that probably would have been used in response to the harvest as a corporate thanksgiving to God for the harvest. We see this especially in verses 9 and through 13, where God is the one who's responsible for the blessing and the overflow of the land. But my eyes are always drawn in Psalm 65 to verse 4, where we have this expression of the psalmist that he is, how blessed is one who you choose, talking to God, choose to bring near to you, to dwell in your courts. So you'll be satisfied with the goodness of your house and your holy temple. This again expresses a really major theme in the book of Psalms of the nearness of God. And the desire that the psalmist has to be near to God, and that God is a God who desires and allows nearness with him. God's not just this transcendent deity that is above all things and does not allow anyone to approach him, but he allows, and in fact chooses to bring near those who are parts of his creation, his humanity. And of course, we know from the book of Hebrews that the only way that happens is through sacrifice, and specifically the sacrifice of Jesus, that we can draw near to him, as Davis preached on a few weeks ago. We could draw near to God, specifically because of the work of Christ on our behalf. And we can draw near in confidence. And when we do, we will find satisfaction and goodness in his presence. That's the only place where we'll find satisfaction and goodness in this life, is in the presence of God. So Psalm 64 and 65, good meditations for us today. We'll move on to Numbers 23. This starts, Numbers 23 and 24 are 4 separate oracles on the part of this pagan prophet Balaam. And the first 2 are contained here in chapter 23 of the book of Numbers. And basically the major theme is that Balaam is finding himself again unable to prophesy curses upon the Jewish people, the Hebrews, but instead he is prophesying blessing. How can I, verse 8, how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom God has not denounced? And of course, part of this I think is kind of a complex interchange here, because part of this is God overruling this pagan prophet to pronounce the things that he would have him to pronounce. It's also partly, I think, Balaam trying to, as I mentioned yesterday, drive up the price with Balak. But ultimately, I think it shows more than anything else the sovereignty of God working in the life of his people here as they approach the promised land, finally, after all those years of wandering in the wilderness. So this is a kind of a transition text that gets us to the end of Numbers, where they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And that, of course, happened in the book of Joshua. And that brings us finally to 1 Peter. This will be the first time we are in 1 Peter. And we've been there, as I've mentioned earlier, we've been there several times now in sermons. I preached Easter Sunday from 1 Peter 1, and also preached this past Sunday from 1 Peter 1, talking about the doctrine of redemption. So just a little bit of background on 1 Peter. I know I've talked about this in my sermons, but obviously the author is Peter, the most famous disciple of Jesus, closest to Jesus in many ways, a leader in the early church. There are some who dispute the description of this letter to Peter because of its kind of cultivated Greek, and they assume that Peter was a little rough around the edges. And Peter could have used Silvanus here as his amanuensis. I never can pronounce that. His scribe, basically. But ultimately, I think we can also say that just because Peter was untrained doesn't mean that he couldn't write in cultivated Greek. I mean, some of the untrained authors like Joseph Conrad and John Bunyan produced some of the great works of literature that we have in the English language, for instance. Peter's writing, of course, as I mentioned in my sermon, to the scattered Christians in Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey. Peter calls them in the first verse here as aliens, speaking of the fact that they have been brought out of this world. They're still living in the world. They're still living in this pagan arena, at this kind of Christian island amidst this pagan ocean. And yet, at the same time, they have a citizenship elsewhere, right? They are in the world, but they're not of the world. And it's a pretty good picture, I think, of even Christians today, as we're increasingly finding ourselves as Christian islands in a very pagan America. And they are experiencing persecution. And they're primarily experiencing persecution. We've talked about this before. Because of their holiness, right? They're distinct. They're different from the world around them. The Romans considered them to, the Greeks and the Romans considered them to be atheists because they weren't worshiping visible gods, pagan deities that you could see, right? Because they were idols. The Jews considered them heretics. They are outcasts. They're being persecuted economically. Maybe not so much physically at this point in time, although some perhaps were, but definitely economically, relationally being persecuted. And what would Peter say to encourage them? Well, he encourages them in the fact that they have a sure and certain salvation. They have a living hope in the resurrection of Jesus that is giving them an imperishable inheritance, something that cannot be taken away from them. This is an inheritance that, of course, has been bought for them through redemption, as we talked about. And I won't go over my sermon from Sunday in chapter 1, 17 through 19. But the other thing that always strikes me about this passage is, of course, the admonition to be holy. This is citing from Leviticus 19, and I talked about this when I think we were in Leviticus 19. Be holy, for I am the Lord am holy. Here's Peter, who is instructing the Israelites, the early church, to be holy, to be different, and their holiness brings persecution. So he's telling them to live in such a way that's going to bring persecution. How can you do that? And the more persecution they experience, of course, the more ultimately, the more they're going to be different. And the more different they are, the more persecuted they are. The more persecuted they are, the more different they are. And it's this vicious cycle, right? How can Peter tell them to do and live in this way? Well, he can tell them this because they have ultimately experienced this great salvation, this redemption that is given them through the resurrection of Jesus, this living hope, this inheritance that will not pass away. And that's a helpful and I think really encouraging thought for this day, May the 14th, 2021. I think I've got all the text. We did Numbers 23, Psalm 64 and 65, 1 Peter 1, and then Isaiah 13. Did we do Isaiah 13? Yes, we did Isaiah 13. So we hit them all. So I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, May the 14th, 2021.